throughout all of these movies pretty much is the way women are depicted is like emblematic of the sort of like world that these movies are depicting or trying to convey. And so it's like pretty much every gangster film is in some way like exploring this. At least the American gangster ones, a lot of the ones we're going to be talking about are exploring this like crime world that in some way relates to a vision of masculinity, or like masculinity, a certain vision of masculinity is like a part of that world.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist, Thomas Flight, to welcome you back to our Gangster Cinema series, in which we cover the evolution of gangster movies throughout the decades. Last week we started our journey in the 1970s with The Godfather, and today we're moving into the 80s with Brian DePalma's Scarface. If you want to follow along with us, see what other gangster movies are coming up, and discuss them with us and other listeners, be sure to join us on our Discord server. You can find the link for that in the description. Thomas, one thing I thought about this week is that I don't remember us having done even like a proper definition of the gangster movie in the last episode. Because that I was looking at some other movies of like the 80s and coming up some other gangster movies, especially in the early 2000s, which to me feels like an era that doesn't really have that like a very defining gangster movie. Like we have the 70s, The Godfather, the 80s, Scarface. Those are all pretty obvious in my opinion, even though there's other, especially in the 80s, there's some other movies as well that you could have considered. But anyways, I was just thinking like what really sets the gangster movie apart from like a more general crime movie, or I'm guessing like within the crime genre, like what does the gangster movie specifically mean, or what sets it apart for you?
That's an interesting question, and I think there's maybe the broader definition of gangster movie, and then there's kind of probably what most of the movies we'll be talking about fit into, which is, I think, a little bit of a narrower, what we will mostly be examining is kind of mob films, even within the gangster film genre. So, I think there's this like gray area between a crime movie and like a mob movie, and a lot of the ones that we are talking about are going to be in more of that stereotypical like mobster film range. But yeah, there's some weird gray area there even, and I think for me what defines this genre is that element of kind of looking at organized crime, not just an individual criminal working alone, but crime as a part of a system of crime. So you either start with a criminal who's like working their way into an established like organized crime sphere, or you start within that, with the guy at the top or something. But it's about this world where there's a set of rules, or there's an established culture or whatever, and you're kind of looking at crime within that world, and then also examining kind of like we talked about before, like potentially why that specific organized crime exists. Like what are the socio-political like factors that led to its existence. I think those are some of the things that gangster films, in my mind, are most interesting when they're exploring. And then usually, usually you're tied to a specific character within that, and their journey. But it's their journey, like into or through sort of like this pre-existing world, I think. Yeah, that's kind of my off the cuff way that I've been thinking about it, thinking about this series and the movies we've watched so far and what we're planning to watch. But what do you think of when you think of the gangster film, and where do those lines fall?
Yeah. I think it's definitely gonna be fun to find like the specific tropes of the genre along the way, and maybe by the end of it we can look back and decide by the numbers which gangster movie is the most gangster movie.
Right, sure.
But yeah, I think I generally associate it also with this rise and fall structure where there's someone who begins at the bottom, rises to the top, and then by their own fault or by their own vice cause their own downfall. So like a classic tragedy. They are basically. I think also gangster movies tend to have like a strong sort of like a bro code almost. Like every gangster family has their own rules. They have their own little culture. There's some twisted sense of honor almost that separates, the mob family from the common criminals, so to say. Yeah, other than that, more specifically related to the way that stories are told, I think they're also often defined by these sudden bursts of very extreme violence, and violence that is also often used as a narrative twist, like some character is unexpectedly caught in like the crossfire or is unexpectedly betrayed by some other mobster person or whatever. And so that's usually a thing that I am on the lookout for whenever I start a gangster movie. Like, does it have those that kind of elasticity structure where the tension stretches and stretches and then suddenly it just bursts. I think Quentin Tarantino once talked about that with regards to making Inglourious Bastards, which has this a lot of these scenes that take a long time to build up. They are very patient with building that tension, and then when it bursts, it bursts bloody and violently.
Yeah.
Other than that, as you said, there's that wider world that the gangsters are situated within. I think that tends to be, at least so far, we've seen. We'll talk about that with Scarface too, where the corruption of the gangsters or the corruption of the mob is to some extent a reflection of the kind of corruption that exists in the legal side of it, also in the police force, in the governments, whatever the kind of the non-criminal institutions are often shown to have the same kind of corruption present. So in that sense, the mob families are more like this dark mirror to our own society in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's, in addition to what you said, what so far as I can define it at this point.
Maybe
we'll
our,
get to some other stuff along the way, but
maybe our definition will start to evolve. I think it's interesting what you said about violence, and that made me think about how violence in the context of these movies is often, the focus is often on like the sort of political violence within warring gangs or within a gang's own system. So it's like, in The Godfather, we see Michael like killing other gangsters in order to, make moves and sort of like gain power. And you might have like, a hit is put out on a normal person that might get into the, the territory, but mostly like most of the violence, at least in the two movies that we're looking at so far, and I think a lot of movies in this genre, most of the violence is going to be like a violence against other criminals or other gang members. And that's something I think that really sets it apart from a lot of, like true crime movies will tend to focus more on like this person, they're not a part of a gang. They're not, the violence they're committing is against like civilians or people out, hapless victims or something.
Yeah.
That's not to say that gangsters don't commit violence against just everyday people, but the focus of these movies tends to be sort of the and so in that regard, they can sometimes almost be like somewhere between like a crime movie, thriller, and almost like a war film sometimes, or like there's this element about them that is the way violence happens is like, there's a different quality to it because it's treated almost like, violence in war or something like that sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's also plays into a larger element that usually makes up the gangster movie specifically, which is that, unlike, for example, heist movies, which are about breaking into some place or stealing some kind of external object, like gangster movies are almost always about climbing some kind of social ladder. So they're more like these political, or the stories are of a more political nature in that sense. And in some ways, therefore, less adventurous. They're not Fast and the Furious or James Bond, where you travel all over these exotic locations. They're usually more, slightly more contained, although we've already seen exceptions with that, with The Godfather, which stretches out, between New York, some other places in South America, I think it was, or other places in America at least, and Sicily, obviously. And Scarface too has some variation in the kind of locations it presents, but still it still very much feeds into that purpose of, in this case, Tony Montana's place within his social system.
Yes.
And can he elevate himself, or will he cause his own downfall? And anything that happens along the way kind of relates to that. It's a very crude summary of what Scarface is about.
Well, maybe that can launch us into Scarface, because I think this is an interesting one to follow The Godfather with, because in some ways it's a very different movie. We've only gone forward 1 decade in terms of the actual film here, but it feels like we've gone forward a lifetime in terms of type of movie. Mostly in part because the Scarface is set much more contemporaneous to when it was made, whereas Godfather was made in the 70s, but is kind of set further back as a period piece. So we're jumping ahead quite a bit, more than a decade in time in terms of when these kind of stories are taking place. And there's a lot of similarities here that you see. We follow a character. Al Pacino's there, but looking nothing like he does in The Godfather. And we're following a character's kind of rise to power and what that means for them.
Both immigrants as well? Or
both immigrants.
To some extent, Michael, I think, Michael Corleone is what's the term for that? His father was the immigrant, but so he's the child of the immigrant.
He's he's a first generation Italian American,
Whereas Tony Montana is a direct, he calls himself a political refugee.
They're also both kind of giving some like social context for kind of the existence of the crime. I think the biggest difference, in my mind, or the first thing that I notice, is The Godfather. In The Godfather, we start at the top, kind of inside at the top with this powerful figure. And then you have Michael coming in from the outside and coming into that place, but we have this inside perspective. Whereas Scarface is much more of a bottom-up story. You have somebody who's a nobody in the crime world and kind of him finding his way into that. So that's the first big difference, I think, that I noticed watching this.
Yeah, I think in that sense it's a more direct albeit some kind of like a twisted version of the American dream, where someone
Yes.
can come in as a complete outsider, no ties whatsoever to the United States, and still work his way upwards. Whereas I think in The Godfather, there's very much, it's more like The Lion King almost, where there's this sense of predestination, where
Yeah.
to some extent Michael is already fated to become the Godfather or to have that Godfather position within the family, because, Vito Corleone was essentially like his Mufasa in some sense. Like there was like a sense of inheritance that was waiting for him, clearly because his other brothers were unfit. So it was sort of, there's a kind of subtextually that feeling of destiny there, which isn't there in Scarface or as directly. There's nothing in Tony's story that suggests that he is fated to have some success either way in the United States or in whatever form.
Besides the massive Pan-American blimp saying the world is yours. That comes fairly late in the story, though.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, there's the sense of destiny here is more, it's ingrained in the United States as a whole, like in the idea of America.
Yeah.
Which everyone can lay claim to in that sense. So yeah, then again, the blimp coming by, the world is yours. Besides Al Pacino playing a much more unlikable character, I think, than Michael Corleone. But I think that's the most interesting similarity, is that there's these two outsiders, even though they're each do it in their own way, or each movie portrays it in their own way. Showing someone coming in from the outside, climbing their way up, and then to some extent having them cause their own downfall by breaking their own code, essentially. Michael had this very strict sense of not wanting to be a part of the family business, essentially, and gradually he becomes more and more that which he does not want to be, at least not in the beginning. I think there's something similar there with Tony Montana, but I think he really much or very much causes his own tragedy through his own vices, really.
Yeah.
Like, I wrote it down, like, if there's a code of conduct that the gangsters have in this movie, like in The Godfather, we talked about it, there's very much this sense of honor and respect and friendship and loyalty. And if you then move into Scarface, at the beginning there's this sense that, okay, Tony understands he has to show loyalty, and then he can climb his way up, and then the way he can do that is by having balls, as he says, to make his moves, and by having his word, his word of honor, to through which that loyalty has some kind of meaning. He obviously breaks that word of honor. I think mostly when he, at the point, I'm guessing we're going to jump straight into spoilers here. He initially, he comes to the United States. He has this friend of his that knows a guy, like this mobster, like a mid-sized mobster that he initially works for and almost uses as a stepping stone to launch himself into success. And I think it's when that stepping moment comes, when he decides, like, I'm not going to work for him anymore, I'm going to work for myself. That's when he kind of breaks his own, kind of essentially breaks the chains that were keeping him in check, and that are now, after that, kind of set him loose, making him more reckless, making him getting high on his own supply, and doing all the stuff that his old, quote-unquote mentors sort of argued against. He was more of this keep it low-key, don't get high on your own supply type of dude. And, once Tony gets rid of him, that's also when all those boundaries seem to break apart. And that's when he eventually messes up and causes his own downfall, literally, as he.
Interestingly, though, the way in which he screws up, this is jumping to the end of the movie basically, but it's relevant to what you're saying. The way he screws up is by having a standard or an ethical like boundary that is less than that of the people he's working for or with, essentially. And kind of, it's like he's the one who draws a hard line, and he's like, no, we cannot kill a mother and children. And that's what ends up coming back to bite him at the end. So I think it's like,
oh yeah.
There's an interesting like dynamic there where, he's willing to do whatever, go, to whatever length, compromise in whatever way, all the way up until this one point. And then that's what gets him killed because, he basically got involved with people who didn't have that kind of ethical, moral boundary, and gets crossed by them.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered it in that sense, but that's very interesting. I think there's also that, that idea then that once you meddle with like a little evil, that you kind of open the door to greater evil, and then once you're not like ready for it, then that comes back to do its reckoning. Makes me think of there's another movie by Ridley Scott which wasn't that well received, but that also plays into those themes very well, and that's The Counselor.
Oh yes,
which is also I wouldn't say that's a gangster movie. I'd say that's more of a general-ish crime movie. But yeah, that's for some reason that popped into my mind as you were talking about that. It's a great movie, I think. Definitely underrated and worth checking out for these kinds of themes, at least.
Yeah, this movie is a much tougher one for me to wrap my mind around than The Godfather, I think, in some ways, because what it's doing is a little bit more like we haven't really talked about it, but like the shift from the 70s to the 80s and from Francis Ford Coppola to like Brian DePalma stylistically is also massive. And this movie kind of like veers into this territory where, there's a certain like restraint to like the character of Michael and how the mob is operating in The Godfather. Even when they're doing nasty violence, it's in this way that has a certain kind of like poise to it. Like, they're going to go in and like shake your hand and then stab you, casually. And like in this movie, it's like all bets are off, we've exploded into this sort of like completely over the top, like opulence. I was thinking about how in The Godfather, the house that the family lives in, is fairly modest compared to like the gangsters' houses we see here. And it's just
especially towards the end. The big bathtub in a room that's all carpet floored, which
right, yes,
already instantly got me anxious.
yeah. I was literally thinking about that while I was watching it. I was like, he's gonna have to change that carpet so frequently. But then I was like, I guess what's paying $10,000 to like get the carpet swapped out if you're looking for stuff to spend your money on anyway.
Yeah, and there's like tigers chained up in the garden. And
yes,
that sort of stuff.
Yeah. But I think like that is one way this movie really feels like a development on kind of in like the narrative of what the mob is within the context of America. Like I very much get this feeling watching Scarface that it's like everything has gotten bigger, louder, more colorful, more outrageous, even more money. And, the 80s was kind of the height of this like, Wall Street, it's like
when capitalism was still fun.
Right. Yeah. There's this sequence where Tony's getting his like kind of business stuff set up, and the way it's shot has this real like fun 80s montage, kind of like, ooh yeah, like it's almost like
a Rocky training montage.
Yeah, exactly.
Doing crime.
Yeah. He's just like laundering money and stuff.
Yeah.
And so, I like the way that this movie is kind of just like embodying that spirit. You can feel it even in how the movie is like shot and how it's depicting everything. It's just like, just outrageously in excess with everything.
Yeah, there's also a very strong disconnect here between the more the type of mobsters that we saw in The Godfather, which were also like these embodiments of centuries old like traditions. They're shown as, I'm not sure if they're like religious or kind of just more performative religious, but at least they seem to care about the church. They seem to care about at least the practices of Christianity, or I'm not sure which
Catholicism.
Catholicism, I think. Yeah, there's these strong like family ties, which mean everything to these people, and which are also at the root of like a lot of their conflicts, at least, especially like back in Sicily, where it's repeatedly emphasized that these families have been at war with each other for like forever. But compared to that, when you look at Tony Montana, like he comes into America at first even claiming that he doesn't even have a family, that all his family members are dead, and it's only later that it is revealed that that he actually does still have a mother and a sister. And but whereas in The Godfather, there's the family is this cornerstone of the whole business, and the thing that supposedly keeps the whole gangster world or the gangster empire together, even though it obviously also leads to a lot of families being torn apart, the Michael killing his own brother, for example. But I thought it was interesting that in Scarface there's immediately this sense of Tony comes to visit his mom after 5 years. He has some money, but he's basically like chased out of the house. Like it's immediately emphasized like that whatever world he exists in, there's no place for family there. It's just she makes it clear like that's a road to ruin. That's not anything that she wants to be a part of. And her daughter, or like Tony's sister, she does get like enticed by it to some extent, which also is what leads her into tragedy at the end, which only further emphasizes that this is not this world, and whatever it represents is the complete like death of the family values as they used to know them, at least, maybe even a little bit like they were shown in The Godfather. The slightly more pre-modern, pre-World War II, or slightly after, capitalism, basically. So yeah, I think just to add like some maybe more sociological context there, I think that's also an interesting transition that the Scarface demonstrates compared to The Godfather, is that it's now completely unbound from these former family values, these family ties, these connections, completely unbound from like religious, moral guidelines. And as you said, like now it's just all bets are off, and there's no boundaries whatsoever keeping the people in this world like in check to some extent. There's no more constraints. There's no rules except for the ones they proclaim for themselves. There's that the first gangster boss, sort of. He had some rules, but that doesn't save him either. And then, as we talked about already, like Tony reaches finds his limit eventually, but that also ends up casting him.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do kind of like how the movie just unabashedly leans into that. It feels very much like a product of its time. Like I almost wonder like how it was received at the time, because now it feels like this very vintage, almost like a parody of like the 80s or everything that we think about when we think of the 80s. And but when that movie came out, it was obviously just a movie of that era.
Right.
Yeah,
it was part of the defining, aesthetic of that time, was movies like this. But I think it's like, my feeling is that in a sense it is a product of its time, but it's also quite self-aware, I think, in what it's doing, where it's like the way it's portraying Tony Montana, especially towards the end, my memory of this movie, because I'd seen this one before, and so coming into this again, I was like, oh, this will be one where when we talk about it, maybe this will tip more into that territory where I'll be like, okay, is this getting into that zone of like glorifying the gangster a little bit and glorifying the crime? And maybe there's a little bit of that here, but I ultimately didn't really end up feeling that much more of that with this movie than I did with The Godfather. And I think part of that is like, in some ways, Tony Montana is more exalted. Like there's some moments where it's like, you're taking a page out of like, the internet alpha male, like, ooh, machismo, kind of playbook or whatever. And you could see some people maybe latching onto that in this character and being like, oh yeah, it's his just like charisma and confidence that takes him to the top or whatever. But very quickly, like, we get so deep into the territory of like him being depicted as just like literally the most miserable human being alive, where he's just like, he hates everything. He like just sits there. He's drunk. He's like, like he's destroyed everything in his life that he even cared about. It's like the picture of like the fall in this movie, I think is much hard. I mean, we eventually maybe get that played out over all three of the Godfather films to some degree, but like specifically more so than the first Godfather film, like the picture of the fall here is much harsher than I think you get from some of these movies. So yeah, I don't know. Like, I think like it is, I don't know. It didn't feel like as much of a movement into just like even with the style of the film, into almost that territory where we're making it look cool. It's like, I mean, you kind of have that shootout at the end, or these moments where it's like, but like, I don't know, like that's directly up against just like the utter despair of what his character looks like surrounding that. So I don't know. I think that was interesting that like that stuck in my head. Those moments stuck in my head more than the other images, but they're both there for sure in this movie, I think.
Yeah, I think in that sense, even the time that has passed since this movie came out only made it sort of glorifying elements less effective.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's so much rooted in a very particular style of opulence and
right.
Look at these portable telephones or whatever that are for the super rich only, and which, when you look at it now, it adds a layer of ridiculousness, like the kind of wealth that Tony Montana acquires, like, and the way he spends it, the way he kind of gives shape to his riches. Yeah, that's not like the way we would do that today, like at least mostly not. Whereas The Godfather is more rooted in these centuries old, like more long form or like timeless traditions, which also carry like a longer relevance into the future in that sense. There's more like archetypal sense of demeanor and, suits, but not like anything flashy. Like I couldn't help but laugh at the way in Scarface they all have their colors like really wide, and it's this very particular way of dressing that was, I'm guessing, was hip in that time, but then quickly fell out of fashion not long after. And so you get this really specific idea of wealth and of riches and fame and of what it means to be at the top. But I feel like the further we move away from that specific time, the more it becomes that almost like a parody of itself.
Right.
And yeah, I also agree that that the fall in this one feels harder. I think it's also because, as we talked about earlier, because he is so unbound from any other connections or values outside of his specific gangster world, that there's also a much stronger feeling of emptiness when the downfall comes around, or at least when he reaches the top, and you get the sense that it's not giving him anything. Also, I like the way he basically had no game with Michelle Pfeiffer's character, and essentially had to force her almost to marry her, or not force, but he has this philosophy like, first you have to get money, then you get power, and then you get the women. And I think Michelle Pfeiffer, what's her, Elvira is her character's name.
Yeah,
I think she's a pretty complicated character in her own right, but she does eventually fall for or in that sense seems to confirm like Tony's view of life, that he has to achieve all these things and then he gets the lady, because that is how it plays out. But at the same time, it's also immediately clear that this is a complete like sham of a marriage, that there's no respect, no real respect for Tony in that sense. So he thinks he gets what he wanted, but he also has the realization that it's still she doesn't care for Tony any more than she did at the very beginning. It's now that just she's leeching off him because she has her own issues and I guess her own dependencies that make her want to be with a guy like that, or make it feel like for her this is worth it, whereas Tony maybe at first believed that once he gets those things he genuinely gets like some kind of love from her that she isn't extending to him at the beginning, and then later he realizes that that's just not the case at all. And ironically, like the only guy who actually does find real love is that friend of his who
Manny
marries Tony's sister, which also ends in tragedy, I'm guessing to some extent because Tony just cannot comprehend that there might be genuine love at the level that they're at, or the kind of the world that they exist in doesn't allow for that kind of love. And so he assumes that his friend is kind of doing the same thing to his sister that he knows like deep down that he's doing to his wife. That would sort of explain that his reaction to finding out that they're together and then shooting him, and also causing like his sister to go into this crazy spiral.
Right. There's also a very strange like subtextual like thematic exploration there, where it's like, or it comes into the text at the end, where she comes into the room at the end of the film after Tony's killed Manny, but there's this element of like her being the object of his desire, or this thing that he's trying to protect. And I think like what is trying to be said through the script and with that thing is like, is that just a weird like incestual like thing that they're just tossing in there with his character. I don't think so. You could maybe read it that way, but I think it's much more potentially a statement about like there's this like unconscious desire deep down that he has is much more for this like rooted actual connection with like his own like familial world and like the culture that he comes from, and like a genuine connection with someone maybe like his sister that Manny has, and like he has completely like destroyed any possibility of having that in his like pursuit of utter greed. And so there's this conflict in him, and also this self-hate and this self-loathing where it's like his sister is entering this world that he went into like completely unapologetically, but he sees that as like tarnishing her. And so it's like in some way he's trying to like, it's like projecting some sense of innocence from himself onto her and then trying to like protect that. It's like it's a very dark, like strange thing. Yeah, there's a very weird dynamic there, I think, with how their relationship is kind of used in the film.
Yeah, that last part of what you said, that was also kind of my reading of it, that he mentions when he first sees her again that it's been 5 years, so the last time he saw her, she was still like this child, and to him probably like this embodiment of innocence and purity. And, when he goes into this world which he sees as corrupt, and, he's given plenty of reasons to see it as so, because it's not just all the gangsters that betray each other, like all the other warring families, like there's or not exactly families, but more like gangs. And even the police are also shown as corrupt, essentially, in this movie.
Yeah.
Same as, with The Godfather to some extent. And so, he does, in his mind, I think he feels like he works his way up into a position of power in order also to protect like that last bit of innocence that he still holds on to from his own youth, maybe, and maybe also just the only thing that he genuinely sees as pure. But then obviously all this plays out in some kind of patriarchal corruption, where he's just not seeing his sister as a human, but just as almost as a property that, like this like safe in which he has stored his own feeling of innocence, or his own projection of innocence, and then he doesn't want anyone to touch it, because that's from the very beginning, that's what he constantly repeats, like, don't let anyone near my sister, don't let anyone touch her, who's that guy going or dancing with her, I'm gonna go beat him up or whatever. So yeah, I think that's again a very twisted vision of who his sister is supposed to be, or who she is allowed to be in his view. It's obviously, it's all projection, like very dominant, very dehumanizing even, I'd say, to some extent, and ultimately kind of pointless, as he still ends up ruining the very thing that he probably wanted to protect the most. But I guess that's the whole point also of these movies, to some extent, that just this kind of life ultimately ends up corrupting, like it spreads out, corrupts everything you want to protect from it in the first case, or the thing that you thought you could keep separated from it, that ends up being damaged or hurt, in the same way that Michael initially wants to keep his wife out of the family business, and then ends up completely ruining his relationship, and even as she commits or does like an abortion at the end, even ruins like his potential, or his desire for a successor. So he ends up ruining his own business to some extent too.
Yeah, that'll be an ongoing theme, I think, throughout all of these movies. Pretty much is the way women are depicted is like emblematic of the sort of like world that these movies are depicting or trying to convey. And so it's like pretty much every gangster film is in some way like exploring this. At least the American gangster ones, a lot of the ones we're going to be talking about, are exploring this like crime world that in some way relates to a vision of masculinity, or like masculinity, a certain vision of masculinity is like a part of that world, or this like idea of patriarchy, or at the very minimum, there's like this intense double standard of like the men are allowed to do the crimes, the women must be kept, you know, in the dark and innocent. There's this very strange dynamic. And so it's like a lot of the films, I think a lot of these movies we'll be talking about, and this one in particular, like is also an example of that, The Godfather as well, where, you know, you have to explore that dynamic, I think, in an honest way in order to explore this topic. But also there's this effect where I think sometimes, I mean, this happens in not just gangster movies, so it's not just a problem relegated to these movies, but sometimes in doing that, you relegate the women in the movies to the sidelines as well, and don't like maybe flesh them out or humanize them as much as they could be. You know, I think you know, that's hard territory to navigate. That's one of the things that I really love about The Sopranos, which is a television show. It has a little bit more room to do things than a movie does.
I still haven't seen that one.
It explores this dynamic, you know, the dynamic of how this world kind of plays out in a gendered way. But because it has time, it like kind of lets the women in that show exist as like fully formed, fully fleshed out characters, where we kind of get a little bit more of a glimpse into sort of like the dynamics in their own life that lead to them interacting with, you know, men who are involved in organized crime, or interacting with organized crime in their own way. I think Elvira, Michelle Pfeiffer character in this movie, is a great example of that, where like she is a great character. I think like the way she's performed, you can feel the backstory, like you can feel the complexity and the nuance to her character, and you can kind of understand in the subtext a little bit of like the complexity of why she's in the situation she's in, but we never get to see or understand any of that. But I mean, that's a little bit the nature of these movies. It would be a very different movie if you made one centered on a like mob boss's wife and it just followed her character the entire time. I kind of would watch that. If there's one out there, let me know. I don't know of any.
I'm trying to think of movies that, you know, obviously in television shows it's easier to explore multiple characters and their interrelations, but in movies it's harder to kind of have those, you know, have a truly like multi-perspective approach that fleshes out each character with that same kind of depth.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just also trying not just movies that would center a more female perspective within the mobster life, but also just that even if they are portrayed as being kind of on the sideline or being sidelined by the business, that they still, movies that still show a more fleshed out perspective in that sense.
Yeah. I think we'll come back. We'll come back to this discussion when we, spoiler alert, get to the Irishman potentially later on in this series, because that's a movie that has both been criticized for how it uses the women in that movie, but also I think actually might do a pretty good job of like depicting, almost using the female gaze in that movie in a certain way. I don't know, that movie is where I think the way the presence of the women in that movie is used in a very unique and interesting way. So we'll come back to this, I'm sure, at some point. But I think it's a notable aspect of these films is that, like, you know, you kind of have these different these different female figures who are like, you have the Michelle Pfeiffer character in this, or the mob boss's wife, who's just kind of like either intentionally or unintentionally like is blind to what's going on and is just trying to like get what she can out of the situation. And then you kind of have these other tropes of like the woman as like the judgmental gaze, which is like the mother that we have here, or like, you know, innocence being destroyed, or an object of abuse or something like that. We get that in The Godfather as well. So anyway, there's these different tropes with the female characters in gangster films, and they get used in different ways. So I don't know if I have anything that like insightful to say about it for now, at least, but I think
that was pretty insightful.
It's worth putting a pin in and noting as something that's a part of the genre.
If you're in the Discord, let us know more movies that tackle this subject with a little bit more depth, or that offer some kind of insight that doesn't tend to be found as much within this genre.
It's one of those weird things too, where if you made a movie like that, where it was like centered on the women more directly, you would kind of have to break the genre, because part of the like genre itself is about following this certain archetype of masculine success. And it's like, so in order to even like deal with this subject, this aspect of like the genre differently, you'd kind of have to like break the whole genre. Which is why I think maybe it'd be an interesting movie to make.
Yeah, it reminds me of the discussion we had on Indiana Jones, where you talk about the
right
breaking away from the sort of colonial subtext of going into exotic countries to steal away treasure.
Right.
And if you know, how can you truly subvert that without kind of shaping up or changing up that the whole premise? Scarface definitely didn't do that yet. I think we're still in the era where tropes were being established more than they were being subverted. I think we'll get to more like subversive elements at the turn of the century, like more going into the 21st century. I think that's, especially the early 21st century, I think is a really interesting time where a lot of these tropes were being kind of reflected upon and, you know, directly or indirectly commented on, or that's also why I'm still not sure which movie would be the best pick for the Zero's decade. So definitely hit me with your best arguments in the Discord for that.
Yeah, if you have a suggestion for the 2000s, let us know in the Discord. We have a few ideas, but we haven't narrowed it down yet.
Yeah, last week my girlfriend, she was out of town, so I had the whole house to myself, so obviously that meant
gangster movies
and watching gangster movies, rewatching a lot of gangster movies from morning to midnight, basically.
Yeah,
it's the rock star life of the YouTuber. It's not for everyone, but
were you watching them in a huge marble bathtub surrounded by carpet?
I wish.
With on a television with like,
I think you could probably watch a movie before that bathtub was even filled.
Yeah, probably.
No, I was just sitting on my secondhand couch, which somewhat adapts to my shape at this point, so it's pretty comfy.
The only other thing I can think of that I really wanted to touch on with this movie is the way I think it kind of, you can tell Oliver Stone had a hand in writing this. It's a little bit, it's definitely there as subtext in The Godfather, but this movie is a little bit more tapped in directly to this vein of like connecting sort of like capitalistic greed and money and you know, kind of, you can almost see the like photos on the wall with the string between it, where like it's like Tony Montana goes to the, you know, the Bolivian drug cartels goes to the U.S. government, and then there's that one room where like they get everybody together, and there's like, oh, there's a guy from Washington here, and you've got the scenes where in The Godfather, it's like, oh, the dirty cop was involved with the other nastier gang that was doing the drug stuff, and like the Corleone family, they were more kind of quote unquote pure within the gangster ethic, and they weren't as involved in that shady world. But then we move into this movie, and it's like we're exploring that more directly, where not only is the cop in there with the gangsters, but he's like directly like manipulating them, trying to get one killed, and like it goes all the way to the top. So I think this movie's like view is slightly more expanded in terms of how it's like connecting kind of this world to just like society as a whole. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only other thing I'll mention about Brian DePalma, which I thought was really interesting, is that I also rewatched his movie The Untouchables, which was also from the 80s, and which we also considered for this episode or for this decade. But rewatching that one, I felt like that one felt more dated than Scarface did.
Interesting.
In many ways.
Yeah.
I feel like they are two like different sides of the same coin almost, where Scarface is very much centered on the vice element, the gangster, whereas the Untouchables are more from the police's perspective, and specifically also the good police within a corrupted system, so more of like the virtue side. But watching that movie today, like it had, for example, it has a very great soundtrack by Ennio Morricone, but I don't think it fit that story very much. If you watch that movie now, it feels more like Steven Spielberg, Indiana Jonesy, even though it recounts a very real story of like Al Capone and the Prohibition and police corruption and police violence. And there's also very much this element of, I think, what has come to be known as propaganda, where it's very much portraying or almost advocating for this perspective in which the police should be able to use more force, and outside of like their own judicial rights, they should be like this elevated, almost like a vigilante-ish level of power, or that they should be given that kind of power in order to combat the corruption that the gangsters pose. Which is an interesting perspective, but as the decades went on, I think it's also become an obviously troubling one, or like at least a contentious one. So it's still a fun movie. I enjoyed watching it, but I was surprised that I liked Scarface more on rewatch when I used to, or I saw both movies years ago for the first time, and I remember back then liking The Untouchables more.
Yeah.
I feel like time hasn't been as kind to that one as it has been to Scarface, which, because I think Scarface just works because it's so wrapped up in its own era that it's become like this relic of it that we can now enjoy as this artifact of the 80s, almost like the quintessential 80s movie. But yeah, while we're on the subject of other gangster movies from the 80s, I think we also have to mention the other great gangster epic from this decade, which is Once Upon a Time in America.
Mm-hmm.
Also really long, 4 hours-ish. But I feel like the reason we didn't go for that one is because I feel like that movie covers so much more than just a simple mob story. I feel like that's very much a story that it just expands beyond the kind of the mobster life and that rise and fall. And it's a great movie. I think it's a better movie than Scarface in that sense, but it's for our purposes here, I think Scarface was the way to go for the 80s.
Yeah. Scarface fits well within sort of the trajectory that we're examining.
No.
But yeah, should we tease next week's episode? This is one that I'm very excited about. The 90s is a great era also for gangster film, and we start getting into the territory of one of my favorite directors, period, much less favorite, mobster directors.
He doesn't even have like one great
yes,
movie in this decade. He has multiple ones.
We could have done this series and done half of the movies just from this director. Yeah. So maybe we don't even have to say it. If you know, come back next week for one of my favorite movies, maybe period. So I'm looking forward to.
I've only seen it once, so I'm looking forward to rewatching that. So I've heard you talk about it a lot, so I'm excited to get back into it.
It's a favorite of mine. We'll be going back. Yeah. I feel like we've jumped ahead in time now, and then we'll be going back a little bit and filling in the gap between Godfather and Scarface, I think. But not necessarily taking a step back in terms of the progression of the gangster film itself. Yeah, tune in next week.
In the meantime, come hang out with us on our Discord server. You can find the link for that in the description or the show notes or wherever you're listening or watching this. We appreciate your support. Thank you for watching this week's episode, and we'll see you again, hopefully, in the next one.